So last week we looked at the first chapter and a half or so, and we looked at the structure of Job, how in chapters 1 and 2 the perspective goes from heaven to earth, back and forth. And we also looked at some of the ancient Near Eastern parallels. We looked at really the fact that Job stands the test of time. As you read the whole book, it's an amazing book. There's nothing fully like it in the ancient Near East. Then we looked at the Satan, as it's called in the Hebrew. It's not a name in the sense of a proper name, like Ben or Gary or whatever it might be. It's a title, the adversary or the one who is aggressive, who persecutes, the Satan. And we said basically the language of the Satan in God's presence is vulgar, it's informal, it's in opposition to God in the Hebrew, and that just shows his character. And I think that's where we left off. So there was this wager. Satan says, if you test this guy, he's going to give up his faith. And God says, I don't know, have you really considered Job? So as you look at the first disasters that come upon Job in the first chapter, they come in very quick succession. The children are eating, and then it hits. So in verses 13 through 15, the farm animals are killed, the flocks are killed in verse 16, the camels in verse 17. And then the most devastating part is his children are killed in verses 18 and 19. And each of these different losses is recorded with 4 lines. And the last incident with his kids in Hebrew is 8 lines. So just total devastation, and it's portrayed as if it comes quickly to him and overwhelms him. And as you read the story of Job, the challenge is to put yourself in Job's shoes and not just see it as an academic discussion of suffering and how should we understand God's sovereignty. Now put yourself in Job's shoes, and how would you respond? We won't allow for Q&A on that, because I think a lot of us would be overwhelmed with that. It's just too much for us to handle. And it says that the people that came were the Sabians. They are found in several places in the Bible, most notably in southern Arabia. Then the Chaldeans. These are Transjordan people that live across the Jordan, that show up around. Ultimately, they lead to the Assyrian Empire, the Babylonian Empire. And it says, literally in Hebrew, the Sabians, the Chaldeans, they came and literally smote. In Hebrew, it's literally smote by the mouth of the sword, which is pretty direct language. Could be poetic. There's also in ancient Near East, they've discovered different swords that had, at the handle had the shape of a lion's head, and the blade came forth. So it could be a description of that even, which is even more, shows the violence. They didn't pass away. They didn't die quietly in their sleep. There's violence here that happens to his kids. Then it says fire of God that came down on them. Killed 7,000 sheep, which could be poetic. We're not really sure. And notice how Job responds. How he responds is culturally appropriate in the ancient Near East. He tears his robe. He shaves his head to demonstrate his grief over his loss. He demonstrates his loss. And he says, naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked shall I return. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. I mean, we could stop right there this morning. That is a remarkable statement. I mean, just without getting into too much application this morning, think about if that happened to you. And I'm thinking about it for myself. If everything was lost in a quick succession, maybe this happens in a day or a few days or a week, how would you respond to that? I don't know that I would write those words. I mean, would you write those words? It's pretty tough to put yourself in his shoes. One scholar says, quote, "This is the noblest expression to be found anywhere of a man's joyful acceptance of the will of God as his only good." That's incredible. The will of God is your only good. Interestingly, this scholar goes on to say, it doesn't even occur to Job in the text to curse these warriors who came and invaded his place. It doesn't occur to him to curse his servants or his guards who should have been protecting the family and the flocks. That's what I would have done, let's be honest. Didn't I hire protection? Didn't I have a security system installed, and I'm paying how much a month for this to be protected? He doesn't. his joyful acceptance of the will of God as his only good. So what you see here is Job passes the first test. He does not accuse God of any wrongdoing. Verse 22 of chapter 1. In all this, Job did not sin or charge God with wrong. So what you see here, if you think of other Old Testament men who lost children, you should think of one right off the top of your head, David. Right? David. No. Another would be Eli, the forerunner of Samuel. Remember, Eli lost his sons. Those two men, David and Eli, they grieved, right? But they knew the reason they lost their sons. David especially. But if you read about Eli in 1 Samuel, he knows his sons are corrupt. I mean, they're the worst of the worst. What's interesting here is that Job doesn't even have a reason. It doesn't appear, I mean, you could speculate, but it doesn't appear that his kids were out all night and they're crazy like Eli's sons. Job has committed no wrong like David. We know David's wrongdoing, 1 Samuel 11. So Job doesn't even have the benefit of the doubt to know why this is happening. And he's still, it says, verse 22, did not sin or charge God with wrong. One ancient Hebrew scholar, commentator, said, we see the greatness in the first chapter of Job's external wealth, but his internal wealth is even greater. That's remarkable. That's a remarkable statement. So Job passes test number 1. Chapter 2 begins with appearing of the sons of God before the divine court. And the Lord repeats what he said about Job in chapter 1. Job holds fast his integrity, even though you incited to destroy him without reason. And we won't get into this here, but if you notice who is implying who's in charge of destroying Job's life, God is the one ultimately who takes sovereignty here. But we'll pass on that for now. John Chrysostom, who's a 4th century, really venerated in the Eastern Church, said that Satan's return after his initial failure demonstrates how shameless Satan is. That most of us, like if you screw up, you really don't want to come back, right? If you have a really bad experience somewhere at a restaurant or whatever it might be, you don't just show up again and do the same thing over and over again, right? Unless you're George Costanza in Seinfeld and you get fired and you show back up to work on Monday, which is a hilarious episode. Sorry. I just thought of that. It's funny. You don't just reappear and do the same thing over again because you have some sort of conviction, some sort of character, some sort of desire to like hide your failures. Satan does not care. He shows up again and answers with this phrase, skin for skin, all that a man has, he will give for his life. So it could be a riddle, a proverb, or some type of bartering. But basically what the Satan is asserting is that Job just cares about his health. And if you haven't touched that, then it doesn't really matter. Like, if you touch his health, if you take away his health, then you'll see the true character of Job. So again, more accusations from the Satan. The Satan also not only accuses Job, look in the text, who else does he accuse? He accuses God, right? He says, yeah, and you've protected him too much. You put a hedge around him and protected him too much. So not only is Satan has failed once in return, which is shameful, but also he's not only accusing Job, he's also saying, God, you really are responsible. Like he's got an easy life. He goes to the beach. He's taking it easy. He's living a nice low country life. No worries. It's your fault, God. I mean, that's what Satan's doing. The Satan is doing. So Robert Alter, Old Testament scholar, says that the language of the Satan in chapters 1 through 2 is revealed as clever, disrespectful, folksy, and rhetorical, while Yahweh, the God of Israel, speaks clearly and plainly so that you understand his words completely. So there's a contrast in the communication. Satan is trying to use devices. He's speaking with cleverness. God speaks directly and clearly, which is a good contrast here. Job is stricken with a disease. It could be a number of things. Here are some of the symptoms that are mentioned in Job. And you read this, it's pretty depressing. Just a couple of these and you've had a bad day or a bad week, right? Here are some of the things listed. Anorexia, emaciation, fever, depression, weeping, sleeplessness, nightmares, bad breath, failing vision, rotting teeth, haggard looks, all kinds of skin issues that he talks about, boils, and all that kind of stuff. That mean some people think some type of leprosy. I mean, his whole body is falling apart. Some sort of skin inflammation as well. It's a bad situation that he's in when he loses his health. And his response is, it says, he sat among the ashes, and he scraped himself with a piece of broken pottery, which could be a reference to sitting outside by the trash dump and grabbing a broken piece of pottery, and just because he's so uncomfortable. I mean, it's a picture of misery, you know. It's a picture of misery. Some people think there may be scurvy involved here. It's hard to know what he's suffering from. We don't know. We just know some of the symptoms. And notice Job's second reaction. Job's wife enters the scene for the first time, and what does she tell Job? Let's go to church, Job. No, she says, curse God and die. We got to quarantine Job. Put your mask on, Job. She doesn't say any of those things. Historically, Christians have seen this, and I think rightfully, as a negative picture of Job's wife. St. Augustine, using a Latin term, basically calls her the devil. Diabolical is the word he uses. John Chrysostom, Eastern father from the 4th century, calls her the devil's best scourge. John Calvin, from the Reformation, calls her an organ of Satan, to try to force or tempt Job, coerce Job into rejecting God. So here you have kind of an Adam and Eve parallel as well. What will Job do? Will he listen and say, yeah, I've lost everything? What good is this God if I can't even have my health? So a true picture of misery in the life of Job. But notice what Job does. He rejects her words and tells her that they should receive both good and evil from God. And the we there should refer to, in the text, should refer to both Job and his wife, perhaps. And the word evil in Hebrew, without going into it too much, refers to anything bad that happens. That's the word used here. It refers to anything bad that happens, not just malicious evil, but anything negative that happens. And it doesn't imply sin on God's part. So at the end of chapter 2, Job's friends arrive from these 3 different regions. And again, we talked about this a little bit last week. This is one of the reasons why it seems likely to and reasonable and right, I think, to take Job as historic, because these places are listed. So the first guy, Eliphaz the Temanite. Teman is associated with Edom. Remember the descendants of Esau going back to Genesis. So you can find that in Jeremiah 49 and Ezekiel 25, Amos chapter 1. The people of Edom and the Temanites had a reputation, and you see this, I think, a little bit in Amos, and Ezekiel too, I think, had a reputation for being wise. People that had, because there was so much trade going through Edom, from Egypt up to Assyria, Babylon, the Hittites, they had encountered a lot of cultures, and so the Edomites were known for being wise, cosmopolitan people who had been around and seen things and had a good perspective on everything. The second person is Bildad the Shuhite, which probably a region, Middle Euphrates region. The name is connected with a son of Abraham in Genesis chapter 25, a descendant of Abraham. And then thirdly, Zophar the Naamathite. And this name is not found outside the book of Job. The region's unknown. So it's hard to know, but it has a specific place listed with it. And the text says it appears that they make an appointment to meet together and visit Job, and it seems to indicate that they knew each other already, and that they had coordinated a time to arrive together, even though they lived very far apart in that culture. And it says when they saw him from a distance, and we're going to come back to this in a moment for some of the redemptive historical aspects of it. When they saw him from a distance, they did not even recognize him. So Job's disease had disfigured him beyond recognition. I mean, this isn't, head over to East River Medical and get some attention, get a shot, get whatever. The guy looks awful. I mean, he looks horrible. And not only that, he's lost everything. And it says here in the text that they sprinkled dust on their heads and in the air, which was a sign of extreme grief. They see from a distance that this is not the guy that they knew who had large family and cattle and flocks of this and flocks of that and servants and all this property. They see a man who's broken and disfigured. it would have been a shocking sight. And so it says they sat on the ground. The chapter ends, chapter 2 ends with Job on the ground for 7 days. They sat with him 7 days and nights and did not speak, which was a sign of extreme suffering and grief with his suffering. And that's a fixed period for mourning for the dead, 7 days. Next week and several weeks after that, we're going to have a lot of time to beat up on Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar. But the fact that we're going to give them credit this week because they're not going to get credit the rest of our time in Job. The fact that they spent 7 days with him in silence says a lot of their intentions. Maybe not of their wisdom or their insights, but it says a lot of their intentions, right? That they were able to sit with him from March 14th right now till March 21st and just sit. That shows that they care about him. They may give him the worst advice possible, but they at least care about him. So we're going to give them the benefit of the doubt today. A full week they sit with him. And traditionally in that culture, the mourners, this is so different from our culture, the mourners would not speak until the person suffering spoke. So they're not going to say, any kind of self-help therapeutic words of, tomorrow's a new day. It's always darkest before the dawn, or whatever cliche we like to pull out. Turn on the Christian radio. They wait until Job speaks. One commentator says, if Job was suffering from leprosy, then the compassion that these men show Job is only exceeded in the Bible by Jesus Christ, who will actually touch a leper. So we're going to give them a lot of credit this morning. They are actually trying to help Job. They don't speculate here for this full week on the nature of evil or the moral question. They appear to be true friends who sit with him. And that's how the introduction to Job's 1 and 2. And so a couple takeaways here. 4 or 5 points, and then we'll talk for a little bit, have some discussion. The first thing is this. This is an obvious point, but one that we need to say. The book of Job introduces in the Bible the idea that suffering is not always the result of your sin. That suffering is not always the result of your disobedience. Sometimes it clearly is. We talked about 1 Samuel 11, David. Clearly the suffering that came after that, which was a lot, everything fell apart for David, was a result of God saying there are consequences for your sin. But here in Job, you see that suffering is not always a result of sin and disobedience. Just because something bad happens in your life does not mean you need more faith, or you need to tithe more, or you need to give more, you need to do more, you need to volunteer more. And that's a problem we have in the Western church, the American church too. Second thing is this. The book of Job recognizes that the Satan has a role in evil and suffering, but it also asserts that God is sovereign over that. That's a clear principle that you find in the book of Job, is that there is an adversary who does want to destroy your faith. That's at the end of Peter's second letter. But he has a limited power, So Clement of Alexandria, 4th century scholar. Actually, no, that's not right. 2nd century. God has provided for us another life, quote, and made the present life the way for the course which leads to it. Basil the Great in the 4th century, an Eastern father who was influential in writing about the Trinity, going into and coming out of the middle of the 4th century, post-Nicaea. He says this, Basil the Great says this, quote, "Be perfectly assured of this, that though the reasons for what is ordained by God are beyond us, yet always what is arranged for us by him who is wise and who loves us is to be accepted, be it ever so grievous to endure. He himself, God himself, knows how he is appointing what is best for each and why the terms of life that he fixes for us are unequal." That's interesting. Yet always what is arranged for us by him who is wise and who loves us is to be accepted. That sounds a lot like John Calvin 1,000 years later. Be it ever so grievous to endure. God himself knows how he is appointing what is best for each of us, even though it's unequal. That's something hard for us in 21st century Christianity to accept and to believe. Third point here. Just as in the Garden of Eden in Genesis 1 through 3, the Satan has a test of faith for an individual in relationship with God. We know in Genesis that did not work out well in that test, right? There was an F, failure. Job appears to pass the test. So he is a different type of Adam. Next point. From the Satan's perspective, Job's piety is artificial and he needs to be tested. In the New Testament, Jesus Christ receives a direct test and the most direct challenge, and it comes from Satan in the wilderness. So just as Job is tested directly by the Satan, Christ will be ultimately tested. And you read about that in the Gospels. Mark 1, for example. After the baptism, it says that the Holy Spirit drove Jesus out into the wilderness to be tested. And that's a theme you see in Luke 8. We'll talk about it briefly this morning, that there is a test of faith that comes throughout your life if you're following Christ. And we've seen that with the disciples in the boat. We've seen that with the family of Jesus. We've seen that with the Gerasenes. And we'll see it this morning. Just as Job was tested by the Satan, Christ receives the most direct challenge, where the Satan arrives and shows up and says, "What will you do? Why don't you do this, Jesus? Why don't you do this? You want this? Why don't you do this?" Next point. Job gives the picture of a supremely righteous man who suffers supreme calamities, which is a direct foreshadowing of Jesus Christ, who is the righteousness of God. That's what Paul writes to the Corinthians. He is the righteousness of God and becomes, therefore, our righteousness. And Christ is truly innocent, and he suffers for the sins of others. So Job is a direct foreshadowing of the person, the work of Christ. So think of Philippians 2. Paul says, "Have this mind among yourselves, which is yours in Christ Jesus. Although Christ was in the form of God, he did not account equality with God to be a thing to be grasped, but made himself nothing, taking the form of a servant, being born in the likeness of men, and being found in human form, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross." Or Hebrews 4, we don't have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weakness, but we have one who in every respect has been tempted as we are, yet without sin. So Job is a foreshadowing of Christ. And then last point, and then we'll talk for a little bit. Last point. This gets into a little bit of the details of redemptive historic foreshadowing. Job's suffering makes him unrecognizable to his servants. Can you think of a prophetic passage in the Old Testament that is similar, that foreshadows Christ? So Job 2 says, verse 12 says, "When they saw Job from a distance, they did not recognize him. They raised their voices and wept, and they tore their robes and sprinkled dust on their heads towards heaven." Now think of Isaiah 53, verses 2 through 4. This is 700 years before Christ. "He had no former majesty." This is the Messiah he's writing about. "He had no former majesty that we should look on him, and no beauty that we should desire him. He was despised and rejected by men. He was a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief, and as one from whom men hide their faces. He was despised, and we esteemed him not. Yet we esteemed him stricken, smitten by God, and afflicted." So think about Christ as he's going to the cross. He's been stripped of his clothes. He's been beaten nearly to death. His back he's covered in blood and sweat. He is physically fallen. The Son of God, the humanity of the Son of God is physically falling apart. Just a total mess. You see a picture of that with Job that's ultimately accomplished when an innocent person, Jesus Christ, fully God, fully man, is totally disfigured as he goes to the cross and hangs there. A picture of, in that culture, shame and embarrassment that you would die that kind of death. So several different ways, even early on here, you see some foreshadowing of Christ. But let me stop there, and we can have some discussion or question, because next week we're going to jump into, kind of take some big sections of the cycles of speeches. There are cycles of speeches in the book of Job. So any thoughts or questions or